The edge of the ravine was sparsely covered by scraggy pine trees and shoulder-high, scruffy green bushes. There was a well-worn rocky path descending past the old hydraulic mine. The troop followed the path in and out of clumps and patches of brush, walking with planned intent over the layered broken stones and dust. They veered away from the course of the mine's runoff channel along another face of the knoll. The old path must have been worn by many passages of miners and pack mules in days gone by. It wound down, ever down, twisting this way then back again. In places it looked like a finely landscaped rock path meandering through a garden of dust-covered pine and brush. As they descended, they could see from time to time just how steep the canyon walls were. Not 50 feet from the path, sheer cliffs could be spotted plunging several hundred feet, then lost behind tree tops below. The sun shone full on them with the weight of heat intensified by the loads they carried. Back and forth, the trail went on, downward. After 30 minutes of carefully navigating the switchback trail in the bright sun, the path receded into darkness under a thick grove of scrub oak on the steep slope. The ground beneath them transitioned from layers of small bits of sliding rock to a deep carpet of dry brown oak leaves. The shade of the oaks was welcomed by the troop as they passed from the oppressive heat and brightness to a shaded and somewhat cooler descent. The trail ran left and the trail ran right. The path split as a gorge fell out ahead of them into the darkness. "This is it," Devin said as he twisted back towards Rich. "This is the turn. We go right here." "Are you sure?" Rich asked. "There doesn't seem to be a trail after a few feet to the right. How do you know where to go from there?" "I've been down here 5 times before." "Yeah, but the trail on the left seems more defined," Rich said. "That's just a small animal trail. It ends around the bend at the cliff we saw back up there." Zeke trotted past them and went to the right. "I guess Zeke agrees with you," Rich said as they all continued to the right. Just ahead, there was a large outcropping of rock the size of a small house that jutted through the dense oak grove. The trail seemed to run around the back side of the rock and head in an uphill direction from that point. "It looks like we're going back uphill here," Rich said to Devin. "No, we have to leave the trail now and keep heading down. The trail goes back up and joins a runoff from the mine there. We'll meet up with the runoff in just a little bit down this way." "Come on, boy. Come on, Zeke," Rich yelled to Zeke, who had run ahead and was standing near the large rocks. "Let's go, boy, this way." Zeke ran back down to them, sloshing through the deep drifts of crushed leaves mixed with loose dirt. The footing was becoming less sure for all of them as they descended the slope that plunged before them. It became difficult for them to stay upright with their heavy packs, all the while sliding on loose footing. "We just have to make it to that tree across the open area there," Devin yelled over his shoulder while pointing. The shadows swam in dust kicked up by their movement. They had reached the slide. This is where the fine dirt that flowed from the mine's runoff cut a channel down the steep grade. It was a motionless river of dirt, dust, leaves, and buried rocks. It would not take much to get it going. All of them concentrated intently on making it to the tree, without initiating a landslide that would, no doubt, choke them in rising dust and might sweep them to the bottom, out of control. Devin crossed to the tree, then Rich, then Zeke, and finally Carl. As they crossed, the slide began to move slowly, pulling in material from above and from its sides. Dust filled the covering branches and spread like smoke above them. There was a low rumbling and rushing sound. Carl looked back uphill and saw the river of brown material coming around the rocks in a slow, even pace. Zeke tiptoed back and forth in an attempt to stay out of the flow. Devin and Rich steadied themselves against the tree and watched the flow slow to a stop. The dust hung in the air, filled their nostrils, and crunched gritty in their teeth. Devin reached into the dirt and leafy material debris around the bottom of the tree, moving his hand back and forth. "Got it!" He pulled out a loop of rope tied to the base of the tree. "I put this here on my last trip down. We'll use this to get down the first 100 feet, he said to Rich and Carl while he pulled rope up and stepped around to the lower side of the tree. The rope began to pull out of the debris material behind Devin as he jerked on it a couple of times and readied himself for the descent. "Once I'm down this portion of the slide, wait till I'm off the rope and behind the tree before you start," Devin said to Rich. When I'm ready for you, I'll give a couple of tugs on the rope in case you can't see me through the dust. Each man's descent would start a new landslide that might overcome and sweep another in its momentum if the descent was not done in an incremental way. Devon stepped sideways out into the main debris flow area, then started to work his way backward down the slope a couple of steps. He stopped to let the flow of debris he had started slow to a stop around him. He took off his backpack dredge and secured it to the round plastic sled. He pulled one of the 50-foot ropes off the dredge and secured the sled to the rope. Devon let the sled out and down the slide in a slow, measured manner. Once the sled was about 30 feet downhill from him, he secured the rope around his waist. He looked back up at Rich and Carl, gave them a thumbs up, then started to back down the slide. Within a few steps, the momentum of the sliding debris above and around Devon quickened to a steady flow. Material began to flow from under Carl and Zeke. Carl stepped down to the tree and grabbed hold of the trunk above the point where Rich was wrapped. Zeke tiptoed back and forth, turning this way and that, trying to stay in position. The rushing sound intensified, and the dust billowed up along the entire flow. Zeke let out a yelp as his back legs were swept from under him. He pawed furiously at the moving mass with his front legs as he twisted out into the middle of the flow. Suddenly the rushing noise became a rumble that echoed through the trees. The material flow above Devon developed a drooping crescent wave and picked up speed. The air darkened with clouds of dust, and the sound drowned out Devon's yell, "Shit!" The wave of debris swept Devon's feet out, his face buried in the oncoming flow. Devon clung to the rope with all his strength to no avail. The rope began to pass through his hands as he accelerated with the flow. He felt Zeke's claws dig into his side as the dog passed him by. He could not breathe. His face was still under the wave of dirt and dust. Devon pushed off with one arm and twisted onto his back, gasping for air. Branches flashed by above him. How fast was he going? How would he stop? Could he stop? He thought. Suddenly, he felt a hard jerk at his waist, and he spun around, losing his grip on the rope. Devon's head swung downhill and his body began to swing laterally out of the flow. He reached down to his waist and grabbed the rope tight around it to pull his head back uphill. The main material flow continued to rush by him with a deafening roar. The air was choked with dust. Devon propped himself up on one elbow and saw that the dredge had wrapped around a tree above him. He pulled the lapel of his shirt over his mouth to filter the dust from his lungs and waited for the flow to stop. Once the flow slowed to rest, it took nearly 10 minutes for the dust to settle enough for Devon to see that Rich and Carl had not been swept down by the flow. They were still at the tree, holding on with at least one hand. Rich yelled out to Devon, "You all right?" "I'm okay," Devon yelled back. He looked downhill for Zeke, but did not catch sight of him. He turned back towards Rich and Carl and said, "When do you guys try to get down here? I think the worst of it is below us now." Rich wrestled his way around the tree and grabbed the rope. He backed down the slide with his pack on his back, swinging this way, then that. The material flow was minimal with Rich's descent, as the buildup had been loosened by Devon. Rich reached the end of the rope some 50 feet above the position Devon stopped at, then made his way down to Devon. Devon was letting the dredge out below him after unwrapping it from the tree that had stopped his descent. Carl then made his way down to them. There was no sign of Zeke. The powdery dust covered their faces and necks. Devon's eyes, mouth, and nostrils were circled in blackened dirt. The sweat across his body was now muddied with the dust. He made a futile attempt to brush some of the crusted dirt from his mouth with his dust-covered sleeve. "Body surfing was the last thing on my mind today," Devon said as Carl adjusted his footing. "Did you see where Zeke ended up?" Rich asked. "He rode that wave down. I didn't see him once I stopped," Devon paused. "We'll run into him in a little bit." "Yeah, I'm sure he's okay," Rich responded. "At some point below, we're going to catch up with that flow," Rich said. "Don't worry, I'll clear it out for you guys," Devon responded as he brushed the dirt off the Tech-9 hanging from its strap around his neck. "You got any more of those ropes tied to trees out here?" Carl asked. "I set 5 100-foot ropes through here last time in. I dug around a couple of these trees while you guys were coming down and couldn't find any." "Do we need them?" Rich asked. "Not for the way down. On the way back up, we'll need them if we're going to be hauling out anything. It's almost impossible to get back up this slide without those ropes." "Makes sense," Rich said. So how do you suggest we get down without the rope? Slide down, Devin responded. Sit on one foot. Use the other to clear the path in front of you. You'll have to turn your packs around and sit them in your lap. Make sure to put your arms through the straps, because you'll need your hands as outriggers to steady you going down. You done it this way? Carl asked. Yeah, every time before I strung the ropes. Carl and Rich took their packs off, then put their arms through the strap with the packs in front of them and sat down. Devin pushed off with his hands and moved out into the middle of the flow, squatting down on one foot. He used his front foot and two hands out at his sides as steering and brakes and made his way down to where he had let the sled and dredge settle. Rich slid down next, then Carl. The debris flow moved with them, kicking up large volumes of dust. The wave had taken most of the material down with it before them. This leg of the descent was much easier. They did this incremental slide down 2 more times after Devin lowered the sled and dredge. Each time they gathered at a convenient tree to start over again. As Devin pushed off on the fourth section of the slide, he saw a large rock skipping down past him. He stopped and angrily looked back up the hill at Rich. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw something move through the trees. Devin fumbled for the Tech 9 and laid flat out on his back across the flow. Zeke! Carl yelled as Zeke came dashing uphill towards them. Devin sat up and pushed off again. He slid down to the sled and dredge and waved back up at Rich. Rich yelled down to him, "What's up?" "Be careful down here. There's a cliff just below me." "Roger that," Rich yelled down. This part of the slide poured through a 20-foot solid rock V-shaped cliff. Devin called it the chimney. Devin lowered the dredge through it, then he kicked his feet over the edge. With his face to the center of the V, he pressed his feet and hands against the sides and climbed down it like a ladder. Once at the bottom, he pushed the sled and dredge to the side and waited for the others. A large volume of dirt and leafy debris poured over the top of the chimney and cascaded down its length like a waterfall. Dust rose and spread from the pouring mass. The flow was steady for several minutes, then slowed to a trickle. Small rocks and a bit of dirt shot over the top as Rich poked his head over. "Should I use a rope here?" Rich asked Devin below. "No, just climb down it like a ladder. We can't afford to leave a rope here." Rich's head disappeared for a moment, then his feet fumbled for a foothold as he backed over the cliff. Halfway down, Rich looked up to see the debris start to flow rapidly over the edge, spilling over his back. "Get down quick," Devin yelled. Rich scrambled to the bottom. Devin pushed Rich past him out of the way. Just then the flow over the chimney increased. Carl burst into the air over the edge like Superman. His arms were stretched out in front of him. Zeke was standing on Carl's back with his ears flopping in the rushing wind. Carl's flight path arched out over the buildup of the debris at the bottom of the chimney. He sailed downward like a cliff diver. Devin stepped out and grabbed the strap of Carl's pack as he passed. Carl's body spun around and splashed into the debris pile. Devin rolled in after him with his hand caught in Carl's strap. Zeke shot off Carl's back and spun slowly in the air, continuing on in flight as Carl and Devin rolled downhill in the soft, dusty debris. Zeke landed some 20 feet farther downhill, tumbling over and over. Rich ran down to assist Devin and Carl. "Carl, are you okay?" Rich yelled. Carl picked his head up from the dirt. Rich could not tell if it was Carl or Devin at first. They both were blackened with dust and dirt. Zeke charged back uphill towards them. "Looks like he's okay," Devin said as he stood up and brushed off. "How much farther?" Rich demanded. "Listen," Devin said. There was a muffled thunder coming from not too far downhill. "That's the river." "I'm ready for a bath," Rich said as he brushed dirt from Zeke's face. "You too, eh, boy?" "Let's go," Devin said as he pushed off the sled and dredge in front of him. Within a few moments, Devin could see the white water through the branches below him. He let the sled down to a tree a few feet from the river's edge and slid down after it. Once he reached the sled, he didn't bother with it anymore. He would come for it later. He wanted to get in the water and get the caked dust off of his overheated body. He slid through the last branches and crashed into the frigid water. He thrust his legs and his head broke out of the water. He gasped with the shock of the cold as he clung to a rock at the water's edge. Several rocks skipped into the water around him. Rich, Carl, and Zeke were coming down. Devin stepped out of the water and moved upstream away from the falling debris. He wiped the water from his eyes and brushed the clumping mud that clung to his clothes.